I took that job because I was tired of emergency. That probably sounds strange, considering where I ended up. But by the time I went to work at Westridge Annex, I had already spent almost a year moving through crowded hospitals, temporary recovery wards, and rehab overflow units that never meant to become permanent. The first part of the outbreak had been noise. Sirens, phone calls, intake tents, hurried forms, family arguments in car parks, television voices leaking under doors, people saying protocol in the tone other people use for prayer. I had worked in occupational therapy before all that, mostly stroke rehab, joint replacement recovery, and long-term neurological care. My job had never been dramatic. I taught people how to move through an ordinary day again, how to hold a spoon if one hand had forgotten, how to stand from a chair without falling, how to turn repetition into recovery. I liked that kind of work. It was quiet. It assumed improvement was built from routine rather than miracles. Then the infection spread, and quiet work became emergency work for a while. After the first big wave, state health departments began dividing people into categories that were easier to manage on paper than in life: acute, stable, non-responsive, high risk, transfer-ready, long-term containment. A lot of people did not fit cleanly anywhere. They were infected, yes, but not dying. They were no longer fully themselves, but they weren't mindless in the way rumor wanted them to be. They could walk, eat, sleep, and sometimes dress if clothes were left in the right order. They just no longer moved through human life in a way families or ordinary hospitals could sustain. Westridge was built for those people. It sat in the Ozarks, outside a town called Bell Hollow, on the grounds of an old tuberculosis sanatorium that had spent decades being repurposed. The original stone buildings were from the 30s, long and pale and lined with broad windows meant for light and air. Later wings had been added in the 60s and again in the 80s. By the time I arrived, the campus had been everything from a convalescent hospital to a state rehab center to a private recovery retreat that went bankrupt with suspicious speed. When the outbreak settled into its slower phase, the state leased the grounds because the buildings already knew how to separate people. That was what I was told anyway. There were 3 occupied wards when I started: Pine, Cedar, and Low House. Pine held recent transfers who still needed full medical supervision. Cedar housed what administrators called stable behavioral cases, which meant infected adults who could be observed in groups without restraints if the environment was kept orderly. Low House, farther downhill near the old therapy pool building, housed the quietest patients of all. Some staff called it the library ward because the people there moved carefully and almost never made noise above a murmur. I was assigned to Cedar on evenings and overnights. Officially, my title was Behavioral Support Coordinator, though in practice I was doing a softened version of my old occupational therapy work. I helped structure the ward so it made sense to people who no longer understood speech the way we do, but still seemed to understand sequence. Chairs in the same places, trays in the same order, night clothes folded at the foot of the bed, toothbrushes upright in labeled cups, hall lights dimmed but not off, doors handled in predictable ways. It turned out I was good at that. The infection had many names, depending on who was talking. Broadmouth in the papers, gray quiet in some towns, Mercer disease in the official bulletins after the first physician who described the long-term cognitive phase. Most of us at Westridge just said the infected because titles stopped mattering after a while. They were people in a condition, a changing one. What made Cedar different, and what kept me there longer than I had planned, was that the infected on that ward were not random in their behavior. They were patterned. Not in the way machines are patterned, more like institutions are. Schools, nursing homes, church halls, boarding houses. Places where enough repeated life gets laid down that people can keep moving inside it, even when they've forgotten why. I did not understand that at first. At first, the annex seemed almost restful. I arrived in late September. The days were still warm, but the nights had started cooling enough that you could smell leaves turning in the woods above the campus. The main building sat on a ridge road above the town. From the staff lot you could see the courthouse dome, the grain elevator, the water tower, and beyond that, the low blue folds of hills fading west. Mornings came with fog in the hollows and dew on the chain link around the service yard. Evenings were all long amber light through old glass, then the sudden clean black of country night. My room was on the third floor of the former administration wing. Narrow bed, metal wardrobe, one desk, one lamp, a radiator that clanked whenever the weather changed its mind. There was a shared staff kitchen at the end of the hall with donated mugs, stale cereal, and a radio someone left on low at all hours, because silence in medical buildings can feel accusatory. I grew to like the place quickly, not because it was cheerful, because it was contained. A typical shift began at 4 in the afternoon. I'd come downstairs, read the day notes, change into scrubs, clip my badge to my pocket, and walk the length of Cedar before supper. The ward held 24 rooms around a long central hall, with a day room at one end and a glassed-in solarium at the other. The windows looked over pines and the lower access road. Floors were old linoleum under a newer shine. The air always smelled faintly of soap, porridge, bleach, warmed plastic, and the medicinal sweetness of meal supplements. The infected did not speak much there. Some had words, but the words came loose or out of time. What remained more reliably were habits. They paced. They straightened blankets. They tapped cups into alignment. They stood by windows. They followed hall light. They became restless if chairs were moved without warning. That was the first thing I noticed. They tolerated structure better than intervention. If you entered Cedar with a gentle pace and the same order every evening, the ward stayed calm. If you improvised too much, it went thin and unsettled, like a room after somebody has opened windows in the wrong weather. So I made routines. I checked room doors in the same order. I dimmed lights from west to east as dusk came on. I placed supper trays clockwise around the day room instead of handing them out at random. I closed the solarium blinds halfway at sunset because full dark against glass made some of the infected cluster there and remained standing until dawn. No one told me to do these things. They were the sort of adjustments you make when your work has always depended on small, practical observations. Over time, the other staff on Cedar started following them too, not as rules, just as what worked. Then came the line. It happened on my 8th night. Supper had gone smoothly. Medication had gone smoothly. One of the orderlies, Janelle, was changing linens in room 12 while I was resetting the day room for quiet hour. Quiet hour was exactly what it sounded like. Lamps on, overhead lights off, chairs in a half circle, card tables folded away, curtains half shut. We put out puzzles sometimes, or old magazines, or nothing at all. That evening, as I was carrying a stack of cleaned cups back from the pantry, I noticed 6 infected, standing in single file outside the day room door. Not agitated, not pressing. Waiting. The first was a former bookkeeper named Mr. Vale, who kept his shoulders squared even after language left him. Behind him stood Mrs. Harlan from room 7, then Dennis Creel, then a thin woman we all knew as Ruthie, because nobody had confirmed whether Ruthie was her first name or surname. All of them faced the day room doorway. All of them stood with that patient, almost schoolchild stillness people assume no adult would ever choose if they weren't being watched. The doorway was open, There was no physical reason they could not walk in. I set the cups down and watched. None of them moved. Then Janelle came out of room 12 carrying a sheet bundle. She paused, looked at the line, and stepped aside automatically. As soon as she had passed fully clear of the doorway, Mr. Vale entered. Then Mrs. Harlan. Then the rest, one by one in order. I remember turning to Janelle and saying, "Did you see that?" She nodded once. "They do it sometimes." "How long?" "Longer than I've worked here." "Why didn't anyone mention it?" She shrugged. "You notice more if people don't explain too soon." That irritated me a little, though she was probably right. After that, I started watching the doorways. The line repeated the next night, and the next. Not always in the same place. Sometimes at the day room, sometimes at the shower room. Once outside the medication alcove, where no patient belonged at all. But the principle held. If one infected stopped at a threshold and stood properly, others would line behind them rather than pass. They would wait until the doorway cleared or the first person crossed. That became the first rule, though I didn't call it that yet. Rule 1. They wait their turn at thresholds, even when no one asks them to. It was so quiet a behavior that you could miss its significance if you were too busy. In hospitals and care homes, you learn quickly that calm patterns are more important than dramatic incidents. A thrown tray gets a report. A room of people who all begin waiting in silence at the same door gets called settled. But to me, it was stranger than aggression would have been. Aggression is easy to place. Fear, confusion, agitation, pain. You find the cause or pretend to. Courtesy is harder. The second rule came a week later, and with it, the first story that really stayed with me. Room 14 belonged to a woman named Elise Crowder. She had once been, according to her admission file, a choir director at a Methodist church outside Springfield. In the infected phase, she was almost entirely mute, but she still folded towels beautifully and straightened crooked frames on the wall with a musician's precise little hands. She also slept early, or seemed to. Every evening after medication, she would lie down fully dressed, hands over her stomach, eyes shut, as if rehearsing a funeral portrait. One rainy night I was doing final rounds when I found Dennis Creel standing in her doorway. He was not one of the aggressive patients. He was narrow, soft-footed, maybe 40, with a habit of touching walls lightly as he walked. He stood with one hand at his side and one touching the door frame, looking into the room. Inside, Elise lay on her bed under the blanket. Dennis did not enter. I said his name softly, more from habit than hope. He didn't turn. He only remained where he was, breathing through his nose, gaze fixed on the bed. I came nearer and looked past him. Elise's face was visible, still and pale in the low light. The bedside lamp was on. Everything about the room suggested occupancy, rest, and a completed night. Then Janelle appeared behind me with the linen cart. "He won't go in," she murmured. "How long?" 10 minutes. I looked at Dennis again. Then, on impulse, I reached into the room and tugged the blanket back from Elise's shoulder so her arm lay free. Dennis entered at once. Not rushing, not snatching. He simply crossed to the bedside table, picked up a hairbrush that belonged to him. I had misshelved it after laundry, and left the room again without touching her. That was when the second rule became clear. It wasn't that he wouldn't enter the room. He wouldn't enter a room that looked fully given over to sleep. Over the next month, I tested it carefully in the small ways good caregivers test anything, by changing one variable at a time and watching what followed. If a patient lay down with the blanket folded aside and the lamp off, Others would enter freely. If the lamp was on and the blanket drawn properly to the chest, they paused at the threshold or passed by. If someone fell asleep in a chair in the day room without a blanket, they might be approached. If a folded lap blanket was placed over their knees, the others circled wide. So we learned the rule. Rule 2. They do not disturb what appears to be proper sleep. That sounds almost kind written down like that. In practice, it was eerie. It meant the infected recognized a visual grammar of rest even when speech, names, and almost everything else had thinned away. Once we understood it, we used it. On difficult nights, if one patient had become clingy or followed staff too closely, we made up one of the empty observation beds with a blanket turned down and a lamp on low. The others left it alone. It created a small island of stillness in the ward. Some nurses disliked this, not because it failed, but because it felt too much like bargaining with something we had not agreed was still socially human. I understood their discomfort. I felt some of it myself. Yet West Ridge ran on results more than philosophy. If a ward of infected people remained calm because beds were made properly and thresholds were honored, then beds were made properly and thresholds were honored. It was in the little break room off Cedar, over burnt coffee and crackers gone soft in the humidity, that the 6 rules were first named. Not by me, by Dr. Mohan. He was our ward physician, a careful, dark-eyed man in his 50s who had trained in geriatric psychiatry and now spent most of his days pretending public health improvisation was still medicine in the old sense. He listened more than he spoke. He wrote notes by hand, even when the rest of the state had shifted to tablets, because he said people lied more neatly in electronic charts. One damp Sunday at the end of October, I was telling him about Dennis in Elise's room and about the doorway lines when he set down his pen and said, "So that is 2. 2 what?" 2 rules. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. He opened a yellow legal pad from his drawer and turned it toward me. On it were already 3 brief headings. 1. Threshold sequencing. 2. Sleep boundary. 3. Object return. I stared at the 3rd. What object return? You haven't seen that one yet? I hadn't, or thought I hadn't. He told me to watch the lost and found shelf in the day room. The shelf held ordinary things. Soft shoes, cardigans, notebooks, family photos removed from rooms during cleaning, a tin box of hair ties, several pairs of glasses no one now used correctly. Any item found misplaced went there until staff could return it. The following Tuesday, during quiet hour, I saw Mrs. Harlan take a wool cardigan from the shelf and carry it slowly the length of the hall to room 9, where she draped it over the foot of a bed that was not hers. 10 minutes later, Dennis took a reading glasses case from the same shelf and put it on the windowsill of room 3 beneath the name card taped there. Neither item belonged in those places according to current charts. But when I checked the archived bedboard from 2 weeks earlier, before our room shuffle after a plumbing problem, both were exactly right. The infected were not merely wandering with objects. They were returning them to remembered associations, sometimes to the current right place, sometimes to the last labeled place they remembered clearly. A comb to the wrong bedside drawer, because that drawer had once been Miss Landon's, and she was now moved to Low House. A book placed on a tray beneath a dead patient's old name card, long after the card should have been removed. A pair of slippers lined beneath an empty chair at the dinner table, as if someone were still due back from the restroom. That was the 3rd rule. Rule 3. They return named things to the last place they believe belongs to them. That was the 1st rule that made me feel genuinely sad. The threshold rule was eerie. The sleep rule was uncanny. The object rule was intimate. It suggested that names, once attached to ordinary things often enough, outlasted language itself in some buried procedural layer. The infected did not know who people were in the conversational sense, but they still recognized where a cardigan belonged, which cup matched which bedside tray, which hairbrush went near the blue floral case. That sort of knowledge survives under speech more stubbornly than we admit. By November, my shifts had a shape I could have walked blind. 4 o'clock notes, 5 o'clock pre-supper rounds, 6 o'clock meal, 7:30 medication, 8:30 quiet hour, 9:30 room checks. Then the long middle of the night, when halls dimmed, machine sounds took over, and the ward seemed to float in its own slow tide of breathing, foot shuffles, and faraway plumbing. Outside, the pines blackened against the windows. Some nights owls called from the ridge. Some nights rain thickened the glass and made the old building smell like wet stone. That is when the fourth rule emerged. Westridge had a bell. Not a literal handbell, though the old sanatorium chapel might once have had one. Ours was an electric chime wired into the building system decades earlier, and still used to mark major ward transitions. Once before breakfast, once before supper, once at lights out in Pine and Low House, though not Cedar, where abrupt sound tended to unsettle rather than soothe. One Friday, a maintenance man accidentally triggered the supper chime at 9:17 p.m. I know the time because I wrote it down immediately. The sound rolled through Cedar in 2 soft notes, the same it always used. Every infected on the ward stopped. Not dramatically. No gasping heads turning in unison. Just a pause, as complete as a held breath. Then, one by one, they began walking toward the dining room. Not the day room, where they had been. Not the solarium. The actual dining room at the back of the ward. Chairs already stacked. Lights off. Floors recently mopped. They moved there quietly and stood around the tables in the positions they usually took before supper trays were passed. Mr. Vale at the far left. Elise near the wall. Ruthie beside the sink, because she always liked standing nearest running water. Even 2 patients who had needed hand guidance for most directional changes all week found their way there unaided. It took us 20 minutes to redirect everyone. Not because they resisted. They simply remained convinced in the calmest possible way that the evening meal had arrived and ought to be met properly. After that, we tested bell sounds with permission from Dr. Mohan and under safer conditions. The result was consistent enough to be undeniable. Rule 4. They obey the meal bell even when nothing else reaches them. This one made the administrators happy because it offered control. A reliable cue, a way to gather and redirect without force. It made me uneasy for the same reason. You could marshal 20 human beings with a supper tone they no longer consciously understood. If that isn't frightening, I don't know what is. Not because it's monstrous, because it's ordinary. Every institution teaches bodies to answer bells, buzzers, chimes, overhead light changes. We just call it scheduling when the people are well. The 5th rule did not emerge from planning. It came from rain. Late autumn storms moved over the ridge in long gray bands. On bad nights, the windows in Cedar ticked softly from pressure change, and the drains in the Old West pipe chase sang in the walls. Those were restless nights for the infected. Not violent exactly, but unfixed. More wandering. More standing at the solarium glass. More hands on door frames. One November night, the storm came down hard enough to knock the outer security lights off for 3 seconds. That was all. The emergency system caught it once. The hall never went fully dark. But during those 3 seconds, something changed in the ward. Not panic. More like a communal intake of confusion. When the lights recovered, Several infected had turned toward the nursing station instead of away from it. Not toward the brightest person, which would have been Janelle with her torch up. Toward the calmest moving person. That happened to be old Mr. Bender from room 2. Mr. Bender was 70 if he was a day, a retired funeral director according to his chart. Infection had left him slow, nearly mute, and dignified in a way that made even the most hardened orderlies lower their voices near him. During the light failure, he had not startled. He had simply stood up from his chair and begun walking down the hall with one hand at his side, looking neither left nor right. 6 other infected fell in behind him. Not because he was loud, not because he gestured, because he moved as if he knew where a person ought to go when the lights changed. They followed him all the way to the day room and arranged themselves there in chairs without instruction. Over the next few weeks, we saw versions of this again and again. If one infected adopted a clear, settled path during uncertainty, the others deferred. Not always, not instantly, but enough that we could name it. Rule 5. In uncertainty, they follow the most orderly body in the room. That was Dr. Mohan's phrasing, and I've kept it because it's the best one. Not the strongest body, not the nearest, the most orderly. If a patient stood, adjusted their sleeves, and began a route with calm intent, others aligned to them. You could see the same principle at work in small things, too. One patient sitting properly at a table often made the rest sit. One patient beginning to fold towels could start half a dozen others sorting linen. Routine was contagious among them. In a way, fear was among the rest of us. By December, the 6 rules had become a private staff document. Nothing formal, no official signage, just a typed page in the cedar break room and a better copy in Dr. Mohan's desk. The state would never have approved such language because it implied interpretation, and interpretation implies uncertainty, which administrators dislike. Still, everyone on nights knew them by then. Threshold, sleep, objects, bell, order. 5 rules. The 6th came late, and when it arrived, it changed the whole ward. Her name was Maria Seaton. At least, that was the name on her chart, and the embroidery inside her cardigan. She was admitted in early January from a church shelter in Joplin after the shelter nurse documented that the infected there had begun arranging themselves around her during mealtimes and evening prayers. The note was dry enough to be medical and strange enough to survive paperwork. Patient demonstrates unusual group-centering effect among other long-term cases. Maria was in her 60s, narrow-faced, soft-haired, with a seamstress's hands and a scar just under one eyebrow. She spoke more than most cedar patients, though never reliably. Little phrases. Not yet. Wait there. That's fine. Sometimes names, sometimes hymnal fragments. She was not dramatic. That mattered. People hear about behavior like hers and imagine a cult leader or a prophet or some fever saint. She was nothing like that. She folded blankets. She drank tea if it was left with enough milk. She looked out at the pines in the late afternoon and sometimes smiled as if somebody had just entered the room kindly. The first week she was with us, the ward became easier. That is simply true. Meal transitions went smoother. Threshold lines formed faster and broke with less staff input. Night wandering reduced. Even patients who usually clustered at the solarium after dark began turning back toward their rooms if Maria was already seated in the hall, knitting motions with no yarn in her hands. Janelle said, "She's organizing them." I said, "Maybe they're organizing around her." Dr. Mohan said nothing for a while. Then he asked me to keep a separate observation log. I did. What I recorded disturbed me more than the improvements comforted me. Maria was not just calming them. She seemed to understand, at some quiet level, all the other rules at once. She paused properly at thresholds. She never entered a made bed space. She returned mislaid objects to the correct old places more often than staff did. And when the supper bell sounded, she was always the first to turn her head before anyone else moved. The ward had held 5 rules for months. Maria made me see the 6th. It took a rain night and an unfinished route to confirm it. In February, a new nurse on contract duty, good-hearted, overconfident, temporary, tried to redirect Maria midway through one of her evening walks. Maria had stood at the day room, looked down the west hall, and begun walking. Not wandering, walking with intent. Mr. Vale fell in behind her, then Ruthie, then Dennis, then 6 more. A line, quiet and steady, moving not toward the dining room or solarium, but toward the old hydrotherapy connector at the end of Cedar, a sealed corridor that no patient should have cared about. The contract nurse stepped in front of Maria and said, much too brightly, "No, sweetheart, back this way." Maria stopped. Behind her, the line stopped. For perhaps 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the entire ward seemed to lose coherence at once, not violence, something worse in its own quiet way. People turned without direction. 2 began to weep. Mr. Bender sat down on the floor. Ruthie started opening and shutting her hands as if the air had changed texture. Dennis walked into a linen cart and stood there blinking because the route in his body had ended somewhere his mind could not continue. It took us nearly 40 minutes to resettle the ward. Afterward, Dr. Mohan wrote the 6th rule himself. Rule 6. If one of them begins a remembered route, do not interrupt it halfway. That became the rule we feared most, not because it meant escape. The remembered routes were rarely toward exits. More often they led to old waiting rooms, old therapy corners, the dining room at wrong hours, the alcove where mail carts had once been staged, or the glass porch in Low House where the sanatorium patients used to take sunlight decades before any of us were born. What frightened us was that the route mattered more than destination. It had to complete. Once we knew that, we began letting them finish whenever safely possible. If Maria started a route and the others followed, we shadowed the line, opened what needed opening, moved carts aside, and waited for the sequence to conclude. Almost always it did. They would arrive at some now meaningless point, pause, look around with an expression that was not disappointment but closure, and then drift back into ordinary ward behavior. Sometimes the destination told its own story. The old chapel door, the laundry dispatch hatch, a shuttered consultation room where a Christmas tree had once been set up, according to the oldest nurse on Pine. Sometimes the route ended at a blank wall. That was worse somehow, because it suggested a piece of building or routine had been removed, but the body memory of it remained. By then, I was sleeping badly, though not from fear. More from thinking. Cedar had turned into a place where human behavior survived in layers nobody had planned to study. Administrative reports called it long-term infection adaptation. The younger nurses called it creepy. Dr. Mohan called it residual procedural cognition under altered affect. Janelle called it them still being here in weird ways. I think Janelle was closest. The climax came in March, in a storm I still remember by the sound of the hail on the west windows. The National Weather Service had been talking about it all day. Cold front, hail line, possible rotation. By late afternoon, the sky had gone yellow-gray over the ridge, and the air in the solarium felt charged. We had moved everyone away from the outer glass well before dark. Maintenance checked the generator. Pine transferred 2 medically fragile patients downstairs to the older stone wing where the walls were thicker. "Cedar does not like weather," Janelle said that afternoon. Neither did I. Supper was early. Medication early, too. By 7:30 the first hail came, hard enough to strike the windows like thrown gravel. The infected all turned toward the sound at once, then away again as Maria stood and adjusted the blanket folded over the arm of her chair. That little act steadied them more than any spoken reassurance we could have given. At 8:12, the power failed. Generator backup came on, but not all circuits caught cleanly. The main hall lights recovered at half strength. The solarium went dark. One of the fire doors at the far end of Cedar defaulted open because its magnetic hold was on the bad circuit. Worse than that, the old hydrotherapy connector door, normally locked, clicked free when the control panel reset. We heard it from halfway down the hall. The contract nurse from February wasn't on. Thank God for small mercies. It was just me, Janelle, and Hassan, one of the orderlies who always moved slowly enough to save everybody else from panic. The hail intensified. Somewhere below us a window broke in another wing. Maria stood. I knew, before she took 3 steps, that the ward was about to rout. Mr. Vale rose after her, then Ruthie, then Dennis, then almost everyone else not already in bed. Janelle looked at me and said, "Don't stop her." I know. That calm sentence is the closest thing this story has to terror. Because what I knew next was worse. Maria was headed toward the hydrotherapy connector, the one route we had never let any of them complete, because the corridor beyond had been closed since before the outbreak. It led through an unused therapy suite and down a sloped passage toward Low House. Old building, bad seals, unknown obstructions. In a storm, with partial war, it was the last place I wanted 20 infected people moving toward. But Rule 6 was by then stronger in me than preference. So we shadowed the line. Maria at the front, cardigan buttoned wrong as always. Mr. Vale behind her with funeral home dignity. Ruthie smoothing the air beside her thigh. Dennis touching the wall lightly with 2 fingers. One by one the ward fell into order, not silent but close to it, their slippers whispering on the floor as hail hammered the windows. Hassan moved ahead and braced the hydrotherapy door fully open so the threshold did not catch them. Janelle grabbed 2 emergency lamps. I took the lead phone even though I knew no one would want a calm, verbal report of what we were doing. The corridor beyond smelled of old chlorine, dust, and damp plaster. Emergency lighting ran low and amber along the baseboards. The old therapy pool room off to the left was drained, dark, and full of stacked equipment under tarps. Rain noise changed here. Less impact, more distant rushing. Maria did not hesitate. She led the line through the connector, down the sloped passage, past the locked linen cage, and into the old sun porch that once joined Cedar to Low House before renovations cut the buildings apart functionally, but not completely physically. I had only been there once in daylight with maintenance. It was a long glassed room with cracked tile, wicker chairs too damaged to use, and windows looking east over the lower meadow. In storm dark, it felt like the inside of a lantern somebody had forgotten to light. Maria stopped near the center of the porch. The others formed a loose half-circle behind her. And then they waited. For what? I don't know. Hail became rain. Rain became sheer gray movement on the glass. One of the emergency lamps flickered in Hassan's hand and steadied. None of the infected tried to leave. None of them attempted doors or windows. They simply stood there, facing east, in the old porch, where tuberculosis patients had once taken prescribed air, and where, later, rehab residents had apparently been brought for some gentler form of daylight therapy. A place built around scheduled waiting. I remember the eerie, homely details more than anything else. The wicker arm split at one chair corner, the faint outline on the wall where a clock had once hung, the smell of wet wool from one patient's cardigan, the sound of Maria swallowing. Then, all at once, the ward relaxed. Not dramatically, just a lowering. Shoulders, hands, breathing. Several infected sat down in the ruined chairs as if they had reached the proper end of a journey. Dennis put both palms flat on the armrests and closed his eyes. Ruthie leaned her forehead to the window for a second, then smiled. Mr. Vale looked around the porch with the expression of a man satisfied that arrangements had been completed. Janelle whispered, "What is this room?" I said, "Maybe where they used to wait out storms." I still think that may have been true. Not for these patients individually, most of whom had never been to Westridge before the outbreak, but for the building, for the institutional body memory of it. When weather became dangerous and power uncertain, the remembered route led to the old east porch, where people had once been gathered, watched, seated, and safely held until whatever passed outside was over. We stayed with them there for nearly an hour. No sedation, no restraints, no crisis team, just staff and infected together in an abandoned sun porch while the storm exhausted itself against the ridge. When the generator stabilized and maintenance restored the door circuits, Maria stood again, turned, and led the line calmly back to Cedar by the same route. No one spoke of heroism afterward, because there was none. Only relief, and a quiet embarrassment among administration that the ward's unofficial 6 rules had proved more operationally useful during emergency conditions than half the formal behavioral guidance sent down from the state. After that storm, the rules changed status. They never became official in the bureaucratic sense, but they stopped being private superstition. New staff on Cedar were briefed on them. Temporary nurses were told not just what to do, but why, insofar as why could be stated without sounding like folklore. The hydrotherapy connector was no longer treated as meaningless old architecture. We kept it cleared. On bad weather nights, we checked the lamps there first. Maria lived another 5 months at Westridge. I say lived, because that matters. She wasn't a symbol, though we made one of her in retrospect. She had constipation. She disliked peas. She got a rash from cheap detergent. Once she slapped Hassan lightly on the wrist for trying to refold her cardigan the wrong way, and looked genuinely offended when he laughed. She remained herself in scattered, durable fragments, which was more unsettling and more tender than any total loss would have been. When she died, pneumonia, quiet, early morning, the ward changed at once. The line rule remained. The sleep rule remained. Objects still found their last names. Bells still gathered them. But the 6th rule weakened. Routes became shorter, less coherent, less collective. It was as if Maria had not created the rules, only held them in a more complete shape for a while. That, too, stayed with me. I left Westridge in autumn. Not because of fear, more because I had given 2 years to that kind of care and felt my own routines thinning around the edges. My old profession still existed somewhere beyond the ridge, and I wanted to see whether I did too. Doctor. Mohan shook my hand on my last day and told me I had a gift for noticing what institutions do to people when language fails. Janelle cried for exactly 10 seconds and then called herself ridiculous. Hassan gave me a thermos with my name scratched into the bottom in electrician's pencil. I drove away under pines, already turning dull at the edges. For a long time afterward, I thought of the 6 rules as belonging only to Cedar. Then, 2 winters later, I attended a state care symposium in St. Louis and met a nurse from a long-term containment ward in Oregon. We were both standing by a coffee urn that tasted of cardboard. She mentioned, in the offhand, exhausted way clinicians mention impossible things to one another, that they are infected, still line up for the doorway if one of them gets there first. I remember turning to her too quickly. "Do they leave made beds alone?" I asked. She stared at me. That was how I learned the rules were not ours. Not completely. Her ward had 4 of the 6. Another facility in Tennessee, I later heard, had 5. A rehab center in Arizona used old meal chimes because spoken direction failed once weather rolled in. No one agreed on the cause. Procedural memory, group mimicry, architectural conditioning, religious or institutional residue in long-term care populations. There were papers drafted, rejected, softened, redrafted. Nothing elegant came of it. Maybe nothing elegant ever could. I still think about West Ridge when storms come at night. Not the dramatic parts. There weren't many. I think about the polished floors under dim hall lamps, the smell of warm milk and bleach after supper, the way Mr. Vale used to stand at a threshold with infinite patience, as if politeness remained even after language wore through. I think about Maria leading a line of infected adults into an old sun porch, because the building, in some part of itself, still knew where waiting safely ought to happen when weather turned. That is what unsettled me most then, and still does now. Not that the infected followed rules, that the rules were so recognizably human. Cue, rest, belonging, mealtime, order, completing a route. You could build an entire ordinary life out of those. Maybe that was the horror of it. Or maybe the mercy. I'm not sure even now. If you ask whether I was frightened working there, I would say yes, but not in the way people usually mean. I wasn't frightened that something would leap out of a room at me. I was frightened by how much of us can survive in fragments and still organize a world. How much etiquette, routine, and communal timing live below speech. How much of being human is simply learning where to stand, when to wait, and how not to disturb someone who appears to be sleeping. These days I'm back in quieter work again. I do rehab consulting part-time and edit manuals for a medical supplier 3 days a week. My apartment is small. My kitchen light buzzes. The neighborhood kids play basketball in the lot behind the building until the sun goes down. Life is ordinary in ways I have become grateful for. Still, once in a while, if I leave a cardigan on the wrong chair or set a book down where it doesn't belong, I'll find myself moving it back with an attention that feels older than habit. And if I ever hear a supper bell in the wrong place at the wrong time, I stop what I'm doing before I mean to. I don't think West Ridge was haunted. That isn't the word. I think it was a place where infection stripped people down to some deep social frame and left us to decide whether that frame still counted as personhood or merely pattern. We never answered that cleanly. Maybe we couldn't. Maybe the best we managed was care without certainty, which is still care. The last thing Dr. Mohan said to me, years ago now, was that medicine spends too much time asking what a damaged mind has lost and not enough time asking what it still insists on keeping. At West Ridge, the infected kept 6 things: a threshold, a bed, a name, a bell, an orderly body to follow, and the need to finish a remembered way before they could rest. I've worked in other facilities since, cleaner and brighter ones, places with newer flooring and smarter access control, and administrators who speak beautifully about dignity. But on bad weather nights, when hall lights dim and people start waiting in doorways a little too patiently, I sometimes think of Cedar and the old sun porch beyond the locked connector. And I wonder how many of our rules were ever ours to begin with. Because if those 6 survived what happened to them, then perhaps the human mind is stranger and more crowded than any of us like to admit. Or perhaps institutions teach us deeper lessons than we consent to learn. Either way, I still notice thresholds now. I still make beds properly. And when a root begins to form in a room, I've learned not to interrupt it halfway unless I absolutely must.